Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Saturday, 2nd September. It will be mostly cloudy all day with highs of 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:04 a.m. and sunset at 7:38 p.m. We are on the 33rd day of the Warsaw Uprising, and Dear Levanger enters the old town, and more atrocities are carried out by this sadist and his men.
You are right, Philippe. We haven't spoken about De Levanger in a little while, and today is a very hard day for those people left in the old town. But Claire, before we get to these atrocities, I think tell us what's actually happening in the old town with the people that are remaining there.
By now, days are almost, they're sort of merging into each other. We have the fighting is ongoing throughout day and night. And so we're going to just continue. We ended the last day with the soldiers and civilians trying to escape the old town in its final collapse and get out to central Warsaw or other parts of the city through the sewers. And this starts in the night of, late evening and night of the 1st, and now still going on through the night, through the early hours of the 2nd. And we've got various eyewitness reports. There's a girl guide who saw people appearing from the ruins. These are civilians coming out of the cellars, and she described them as people black-bearded and in rags. Even the civilians now are reduced to that level, and they're some of the first to get out. But I also, when I was researching, two of my books, actually, I interviewed a fantastic woman called Marzena Scherbel, very sadly, no longer with us. She died last year. But she was a scout during the Warsaw Uprising, and she also got out of the old town through the sewers at this point. So when I interviewed her, she described just these absolutely horrific conditions. She went down into the sewers with a group of people. The sewer that they were in, some of them were larger, but the one that she was in, she had to crawl. She said the space was so tight that we were knocking our heads against the wall. And she didn't really mention, if they're crawling, that means they are going through the waste fluids that runs through sewers. So at this point, they're circular sewers. So it's quite hard to stand anyhow. They're crawling on this circular brick floor, and that is full of, obviously, sewage. But because the old town has been under bombardment for so long now, it's also full of broken bits of wood that's gone through the drains, broken glass. There are dead rats down there. The stink of it is absolutely fetid. So when she goes down, she looks up to her guide, and he says that you'll be out within 2 hours. But far from it. Within 2 hours, they find that their passage is blocked. They can't progress any further. She said that it was pitch black, but also hot now. It's still only early September, so it's not really, later autumn yet. It's hot anyhow, but down there, the air can't circulate at all. And she said when they were forced to stop and wait, they didn't know why. They couldn't see anything. They were all crammed together. She said some of the soldiers lost their nerve, and this is a quote from her. She said, the girls were much stronger than the boys. They were more disciplined and more patient. The boys became mad and wanted to shoot themselves. It was the girls who said, you have to be quiet as the Germans will hear us. Now, there's a couple of things in that. Marzena is a very strong woman herself, and she took a very strong line on this. I'm not saying that her memory is wrong, but obviously that's what she chose to remember. Maybe that's something that she took pride in, that the women in that group were so strong and controlled at that moment. And the other thing to take from that is that the Germans will hear us. What's she mean? Well, of course, the Germans worked out that people were travelling across the city or under the city in the sewer system, and they would listen out. They had special German patrols listening out for movement under the city. And then when they found it, they would sometimes pour down petrol and then set the slurry ablaze and, kill everyone that way. Sometimes they would block the ends of sewers with cement so that people would drown or they just wouldn't be able to find their way out. So Marzena is down there blocked. She is, at that point, the people down there, they've got some rope and they decide to tie themselves to each other in a sort of convoy, a line, so that no one will be left behind. And then this order comes from the front, and then they have to push forward. And the blockage had been pushed into part of the wall. And they all had to push themselves one by one and haul each other through on the rope. And what they were pushing past was a bloated corpse that had swelled up under there that she had to make her way past. It was 12 hours before Marzena and her group managed to climb out of the sewers, still roped together like herrings, as she put it. So that I mean, there's much more than that, but I think that gives you a pretty graphic picture of what the conditions were like down there. But also Zoe, who is the woman that I've been following in my new book, and she is involved. I mean, she's mainly doing supply of food and medicines and water, but at this point, she also is involved in manning one of the sewers to help first direct people to where there is a safe exit, but also to pull out these exhausted fighters at the other end when they reach areas that are still held by the insurgents. So Zoe was based at a manhole at the southern end of that historic, beautiful thoroughfare, Novi Sviat. And she then has to help heave out groups of what she called stinking, exhausted and often wounded soldiers. I hate to think of the hygiene of what's got into their wounds. And the first group she pulled out was 17 men, and they lay just absolutely exhausted on the street in front of her. And they were coated in brown filth so much they just looked like, a bit of a bronze sculpture, really, just unmoving there. And then she took them, they'd sort of organised this, she took them to the Palladium Stadium, the Palladium Cinema, which you mentioned earlier. That's where they had shown the film footage that had been taken earlier on in the Warsaw Uprising. But now it's set up with barrels of water, that's mostly rainwater, dry clothes, medicines, and what little food they had. At this point, Zoe said that she was down to baking the yeast from the brewery. They'd already now had most of the grain and the sugar from it. So she's baking the yeast into little biscuits that are, these very thin biscuits, look a bit like communion wafers. But before she handed out the food, one of the guys that she'd just pulled out of the sewers, apparently he was just staring at her. And then he reached and touched her face with his filthy fingers, and he just said, washed, because she was clean. And she had blonde hair. And for him, his eyes were still readjusting to the light, I guess, from being down in the sewers. And everyone was absolutely filthy. So around 5,000 Poles and, in fact, 150 German prisoners of war they took with them managed to get through the sewers to the safer districts of Warsaw by mid-morning or midday of the 2nd. And one of the last to go through was General Bohr himself. He described his journey as well. He said the wastewater was up to his thighs and there was a really strong current in the sewer that he was going through. He found it very hard to keep his balance. And he just put one hand on the shoulder of the man in front, and that's how they made their progress. And it took him 5 hours to get through to the streets above. And he described it, he said, the fetid stench made me sick and brought tears to my eyes. And of course, these are the stories we have are all of the lucky people, really. I mean, it sounds so horrific, but these are the people who managed to get out and give their testimony, because we know that if soldiers emerged and found themselves coming up through a manhole in enemy-held territory or an area that's still a battle zone, quite often they were just immediately mowed down by machine gun. So, there were huge losses, but overall, it's this extraordinary evacuation that brings out around 5,000 people from the old town before it's completely decimated.
It was really interesting. If you read the testimonies of those people that were in the sewer, that specific time of the sewer, then that is what they remember. They remember seeing the cleanliness, that the lights were still on, that people were still walking around the streets, that the area wasn't completely and utterly destroyed, just as it was in the old town. The other thing we've forgotten to say, or need to remind our listeners, that there's still 35,000 people left in the old town, predominantly civilians, those that are wounded. This is not the end for the old town. Still more things are happening. And Claire, I'll let you continue with this.
What I think is so extraordinary about it, it's really interesting you say that, is obviously the old town has been completely, that's the focus of the fighting at the moment. It's been completely bombarded and decimated, and they're making their assault. But the rest of Warsaw, they come out of the sewers and they go, gosh, you're so clean. It's so amazing. It's so calm here. But of course, the whole of Warsaw is a war zone. It's an ongoing battle. It's just relative. And so it just shows how appalling the situation, how critical the situation is in the old town right now. But of course, I mean, the rest of Warsaw is still under fire. And so there is a bit of an adjustment to be made after that immediate sense of relief that they've got out of the old town. There is still bombardment going on. And in fact, this is the day that the Germans destroy a very famous symbol of Warsaw, which is Zygmunt's column, which is a classic bit of column architecture. It was erected in 1644 in honour of King Zygmunt III by his son, because he knew his father, the king, had been a real art appreciator. So it was put up then. And it was this landmark in the city everyone would recognise. It's a bit like the Eiffel Tower or the Reichstag in that regard. But on this day, it was hit by shell from a German tank gun, and it was toppled. I mean, the parts of it, the parts of this column are still there. They lie on the ground beside the royal castle. The royal castle was completely destroyed as well, but that was rebuilt after the wall. And you can see parts of this column still on the ground there. But interestingly, actually, the column is used as a way to date photographs of the Warsaw Uprising as well, because it was such a filmed and such a photographed engagement. If you see photographs and the column is still standing, you know that that photograph was taken before the 2nd of September. Of course, if it's down, it's after the 2nd of September. So we can use the destruction of landmarks like that to help date the photographs as historians looking back as well. So even in the areas that are not the Old Town, you can see there is ongoing bombardment. And Alina, in another area, I think just south of the Old Town, you've mentioned before the Warsaw University, but there was another attempt to take that today as well, wasn't there?
Right, so I promise this is going to be the last time I mention the Warsaw University, but this is the third and final attempt to try and capture it. Just reminding our listeners, this is where we have the Nebelwerfer, we have the whole massive cascade of weapons. It's a very desirable point for the insurgents to be able to capture, and it's today at about 4 p.m. that the insurgents begin to attack the Warsaw University. So the main assault begins on one of the side streets further in the south, and they try to attempt to blow up the university gates. This obviously fails. But the combat vehicles, we have Kubush, which we've spoken about, the made armoured car, managed to get inside, alongside Szary Wilk, or Grey Wolf, the captured mini tank as well. They do manage to get inside. They only get inside after the gate was forced open with a pole. So blowing it up doesn't work. So now this time they have to be able to try and force it open with a pole instead. Grenade fragments damage the tyres of the Kubush, the little armoured vehicle that they have. So therefore Kubush and the crew of this vehicle have to remove themselves and withdraw from the fight. The second car, which is the Grey Wolf, that manages to ram into the barbed wire fences and enter the university through another side gate. It's forced to withdraw after the Germans shoot at it with an anti-tank gun. So far, this is not a very successful operation and is not going very well for the insurgents. Then they try to capture an enemy-held outpost. This, again, ends in complete and utterly defeat. So what is the reason why they were defeated? Well, one, it was the lack of surprise. Two, the shortage of weapons. And also the other problem with this, there's a lack of cooperation between all the attacking units. The Polish losses amounted to 5 killed and 30 wounded. At the same time this attack is happening, an assault group from the Handlash group also go towards the Saski Palace, which is on the other side, and their intention was to divert the Germans' attention from the troops who were attacking the university. But the forces that were assigned to this operation were too small. There wasn't enough time to prepare. There wasn't enough time to coordinate what they were doing. And it just ended up in total, utter failure. So not only was the first and the second attack that ended in failure, the third one too. So this is a negative point of the insurgents and the attack of the insurgents of what was happening in the uprising. Remember, these are not all trained soldiers. They are not all trained in weaponry and tactics and whatnot. Some of these men had just picked up a gun that day. It is just an absolute mess. Now, the other thing that's happening is now that the old town has fallen, the Germans have decided to concentrate on different areas and different districts of Warsaw. We are going to start coming to Powiśle, which will be the next district, but Sadyba, which I've mentioned a couple of days ago, falls today as well. It's not very much concentrated on because when historians focus, they focus on the old town. They don't focus sometimes on the other smaller district. So Sadyba, which is in the south, that falls after 2 days worth of fighting and constant bombardment. Now, I'm going to read you a quote by Andrzej Bukar, and he will give you an example of the district of Sadyba and what it actually looked like. So, quote, he says, Sadyba was a garden city. It was very difficult to defend. There weren't block of flats everywhere. You could set up firing positions or something like that, or where you could throw bottles from floors or something. It was really difficult here. There were completely open fields, gardens and small houses, so that all artillery fire often hit the target very well. So we have this whole view, or at least you can imagine this in your mind, where, for example, the old town, heavily built up, lots of tall buildings, beautiful tenement houses. Sadyba's completely different. Now Sadyba's completely different to what it was back in 1944, or at least even during the German occupation. It's more of a built-up up area. But at the time, during the Warsaw Uprising, it's quite an open area. It's not very built. There are no tall blocks of flats. And it is very, very, very easy to be able to invade on the German perspective. So all the commanders in the area of Sadyba are killed in one bombing incident. They were all in the fort in Sadyba, and they were all killed during a bombing raid. So not only is this a difficult place to defend, all your commanders are dead, all because of one bomb that fell. So there's still constant air bombing and artillery shelling of Sadyba. So once Sadyba is defeated, the Germans take over and they begin the same process of what they're actually doing in the old town, which Roger will come and talk about this in a moment. But they go in, they murder the wounded, they capture the insurgents, and about 700 civilians in the area. And a number of people also in the fort of where the commander was killed and buried after a bombing. A number of men were actually suspected of being insurgents and were shot on the fort grounds as well. The Germans would then go from building to building. They'd throw grenades into the cellars where civilians were sheltering and just carry out random execution, just pull people out of the building and shoot them. They weren't men of fighting age. These are women, children, elderly. These are people who are not insurgents. And during the excavation process, in one mass grave, they find 8 naked women with their hands tied with barbed wire. So this is not just ad hoc killing and whatnot. This is brutal, absolutely brutal. 80 residents from 3 streets are completely and utterly eliminated. So continue with these atrocities. This is not the end of all of these mass murders in Warsaw. The old town is heavily affected by this. I'm going to let Roger tell you about what's happening there.
Yeah, one of the consequences of the fall of the old town to the Germans is that you have a sort of re-emergence of some of those hideous atrocities that we saw much earlier in the uprising, where you have German troops and very often those sort of SS troops, particularly in this case the Dirlewanger Brigade, being let loose, as it were, on civilian populations. And this is, again, on this day, we see those that were left, those that couldn't be evacuated from the old town via the Suez and elsewhere, as we've been hearing, are left to the mercy of those German forces. And in the worst cases, where they encounter the Dirlewanger Brigade, then you have, again, that sort of re-emergence of massacres. So there are 1,500, both wounded and medical staff, are murdered on the 2nd of September by the soldiers of the Dirlewanger Brigade. And it's sort of an echo back to those the massacres of Wola and Ochota at the beginning of the uprising. At the same time, many thousands do manage to filter through German lines and are then they join those that are sent to Pruszków. We've talked about the camp that is established at Pruszków, the transit camp there. So many thousands go through German lines and are then filtered and sent from Pruszków and off to, as we've said before, various concentration camps, Auschwitz, Belsen and elsewhere, ultimately for labour. So this is, it's a grievous day. It's a grievous loss, the old town, for the Poles. And as I said, you see a lot of those really gruesome scenes, that really ugly scenes that we saw at the very beginning of the Rising, repeating themselves.
Claire, you've got a story you want to throw in there, a personal one, don't you?
So among the medical staff who refused to abandon the wounded casualties that they were caring for was a friend of Zoe's. Her name was Hanna Żabinska, as she was known as Rana. That was her nom de guerre during the war. She was a children's doctor, but of course, during the uprising, she is caring for the wounded Home Army soldiers, wounded civilians, which is also caring for German casualties as well. The Poles they included spaces in their hospitals. I mean, I say in their hospitals, in the cellars and basements, but wherever they had medics working, they also treated the German prisoners of war as well. And Rana had very sensibly moved the German casualties that she was looking after towards the shrapnel-scarred entrance of her basement ward. She was hoping that this might protect them, that the Germans would recognise the care that was being taken here, and not kill their own and not kill the rest of them as well. But when the German troops attacked, Rana ran forward, shouting for them to stop, pointing out that she had German prisoners of war they were tending there. But she was killed immediately in the blast from a hand grenade. one of the witnesses did survive from that, and Rana was posthumously decorated with the Virtuti Militari. She already had the Gold Cross of Merit. She was an incredibly courageous young woman. She was young, but she was married. She had 2 children, and they fortunately did survive the Warsaw Uprising. She had a son and a daughter, and her daughter actually did go on to become a doctor herself. So she carried her mother's story forward.
What a beautiful, yet absolutely horrific story from you, Claire. Thank you for that. But I think it's very beautiful that her daughter manages to carry on her legacy. And many Poles have tried to do that with their family members. So, right, we haven't touched on what the Germans are doing today, and we're running quickly out of time. Roger, where are we with that?
Yes, we've been following the diary of Erich von den Bach, the SS commander in Warsaw, who, obviously, you can imagine with the fall of the old town to German forces, is cock a hoop, is excited about that victory, as he would see it. And he sends a message on the 2nd of September to Himmler, to his boss, effectively, saying very proudly, "I'm reporting this morning that the northern cauldron," as he puts it, "is completely in our hands. Currently, countless civilians and prisoners of war are being released." That's putting rather a gloss on it. 150 German soldiers were released and ceremonially welcomed at Rheinfeld's command post. So again, you can see how he's reporting it. Much more interesting. I mean, that's relatively straightforward. It's perhaps a little bit glossing over the reality of what was happening on the ground, as we said before, with Dirlewanger's troops committing another round of atrocities in the old town. So it's glossing over some of those aspects, but it's quite interesting how there's a report the same day from Radio Berlin, and it's a report in English, interestingly. So you can see how this is now propaganda packaged for the Western audience. Yeah, you can see there's this message or this report on Berlin radio, which is in English, and it's obviously being targeted at Western audiences, talking about the fall of the old town and the general situation in Warsaw. And you can see how the Germans in this report, which I'll come to a couple of quotes from it in a minute, but you can see how they're sort of posing almost as the good guys, but certainly there's no hint at all that the Eastern War, remember we said before that the Eastern War has a very different tone, a different, much more brutal quality to it, if you like, than the Western War. But in this case, it's the Germans, as if what was going on in Warsaw was very similar to what was going on, in Paris or anywhere else. So it just sort of shows up that how that messaging was sort of put together by the Germans. So they talk about that the rising was launched, as they say, with no consideration given to the civilian population of Warsaw, and that more than 90% of Warsaw's inhabitants were surprised by the uprising and opposed it. I mean, neither of those two statements obviously are true. Goes on to say that the bandits, which is the insurgents, are not being fought on the German side using Soviet methods, they say, but according to European and German rules of war. Again, I mean, a blatant untruth, given all of the atrocities that were being committed. And then it goes on to say that German soldiers often risk their lives to pull women and children from burning houses. And the levels of mendacity being committed here are absolutely astonishing, because we know already how we've described what's happened at Wola Ochota, now in the Old Town on this very day, what atrocities German soldiers were capable of committing against Polish women and children in Warsaw. So they certainly weren't risking their lives to pull them out of burning houses. They were most likely pushing them back into burning houses. So this is an astonishing piece of mendacity. But you can see how, this is part of that PR war. This is the Germans trying, if you like, to sort of influence Western opinion to reduce or to make less obvious the sort of brutal nature of their campaign to crush the Warsaw Rising.
Well, that's the end of day 32. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, rate us if you haven't, and send us your questions so we can get them answered by the Warsaw Uprising Museum, myself, or we might even pull in Roger and Claire and get them to answer a couple of questions. So send them all in and we'll get them answered for you. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow for day 34.